Good afternoon. I'm MacKenzie Babb, External Affairs Director for the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise, and I'm so pleased to welcome you all here today. I am thrilled to introduce you all to my friend and colleague, Mary Moore Hamrick. I am proud to say Mary Moore serves not only as a Senior Fellow at the Kenan Institute, but also as CEO of Political Quotient Advisors. She previously served as Chief Public Policy Officer for Grant Thornton and has spent more than 30 years working on Capitol Hill. I'll say Mary Moore is particularly well equipped to handle the partisan divide, given she holds her JD MBA from UNC and her undergraduate degree from Duke. Today, we'll be discussing a number of top issues and policy implications of the upcoming presidential election, with a particular eye toward the impact on business, all from an apolitical perspective, just straight facts down the middle. We'll have a few polling questions for you throughout today's presentation, so I invite you to participate in those when they come up. Keep in mind, all answers will be kept anonymous. We'll then spend the last 20 minutes or so fielding your questions and welcome you to submit those anytime using the Q&A function there at the bottom of your screen. Note that we've had a number submitted already, so may not be able to get to all questions, but we will certainly do our best. With that, it's my pleasure to welcome Mary Moore. Let's kick things off with an overview of the current state of play. It's clear we're living in turbulent times on a number of fronts. I am eager to hear how you see this turbulence shaping the election.
Oh my goodness, MacKenzie, we truly are operating in turbulent times. And this election is occurring against the backdrop of three black swan events. We've had the COVID-19 pandemic, the resulting economic shutdown, and a national civil justice unrest that we haven't seen before. And we've had two October surprises with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the nomination of a new Supreme Court Justice, Amy Coney Barrett, and that the president would get COVID. Who would think? But I will say that UNC's Kenan Institute's 7 Forces report is recommended reading as we go to the background on what's happened in this COVID pandemic.
Absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that, Mary Moore. And we do have a link to that report there in the chat function. So for folks who haven't had a chance to take a look yet, we welcome you to check out that report. It does cover the 7 vital trends that are reshaping the economy throughout the pandemic and also beyond. So Mary Moore, obviously 4 years ago, most pollsters didn't predict Donald Trump becoming president. He continues to lag in the polls today. What's changed and what stayed the same during this election cycle?
Well, it's when we were back in 2015, the challenge was this was a choice election. It was a choice between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. This time around, President Trump is campaigning as a president, not as a candidate. And so this is what Charlie Cook of the Cook Report would call a referendum on the president. It's an opportunity for the voter to decide if they want to renew on an up or down vote President Trump's contract for the next 4 years. The president is campaigning on his pre-COVID economy. That's where he's strongest in the polls. He's campaigning on civil disorder, that he would bring law and order to America, and on his Supreme Court and judicial nominees. Vice President Biden is definitely wanting to make this a referendum on President Trump, given President Trump's approval ratings. And Vice President Biden is saying that he is a unifier who would bring the country back together, provide better COVID management, and allow the economy to reopen safely. And finally, given his expertise in foreign affairs, Vice President Biden says that he would like to play a more unifying role globally. So, MacKenzie, those are where the two candidates are coming from in the final days going into the election.
Terrific. Thank you, Mary Moore. That leads us into our first poll question. I'm going to read that out loud. You're going to get a pop-up on your screen with this question. It reads, when did you decide which presidential candidate you'd be voting for? Your options are before the first presidential debate, after the first but before the second presidential debate, since the second presidential debate, or have not yet decided. So we'll see how those results come in. Mary Moore, I'm interested to see how some unconventional debates this year are swaying the minds of our voters here with us today.
You know, it's interesting. I'm not sure exactly how and when people made up their minds. It'll be interesting to see what our following has to say here. But I'm not sure. It seems to me a lot of people made their minds up months ago. So we'll see what happened.
Well, we just got the results in, and I'm not terribly surprised to say this, but we've got 90% of folks saying they made up their minds before the first presidential debate. 1% said after the first, but before the second presidential debate. 3% since the second presidential debate, and a full 6% have not yet decided. So, Mary Moore, what do you make of those results?
Well, it just shows that this is really more of a personality contest. Than looking at the issues. I think that neither candidate has really done the best job in outlining what they're for or how they're governed. But let's do explore what we know about their positions on the pandemic, on the economy, taxes, climate, energy, and infrastructure, on trade, foreign affairs, and national security. We'll take a look at those.
Absolutely, thanks. Well, moving right along, I know that surveys have shown that after consumers, business is most affected by government laws and regulations. In today's world, that seems even more true as the C-suite wrestles with the pandemic's economic impact, possible continued shutdowns, and employee safety. Let's take a look.
All right, let's see. We've got our 5 issues that we're going to take a look at. Let's start with the with healthcare and the pandemic.
Absolutely. Living during a global pandemic has certainly elevated the topic of healthcare in the minds of most voters. Where do the candidates stand on pandemic response and on healthcare more generally?
Well, this is an area where the candidates definitely differ. If you look at President Trump, he campaigned in 2016 on repealing Obamacare through increasing competition by giving states various options to opt out of the Cadillac plan requirements that were instituted in the Affordable Care Act. They are similar in that they both candidates want to lower prescription drug prices, and they're similar in that situation, but they're different in their approach to COVID. We've often heard President Trump say that the cure can't be worse than the disease, and he really looks to more of a state approach to allow each state to decide their restrictions, their mask wearings, when business opening. So he really takes is deferring to the states. Now, the one area where President Trump is approaching this on a federal level is the development and distribution of a vaccine. You've heard him talk about Operation Warp Speed, which is a federal program for a vaccine development, antiviral development, and getting approval of that. So you've seen that on the one hand by President Trump. But if we take a moment and look at Vice President Biden, he really wants to take an overall federal response to the COVID crisis as opposed to President Trump's state-by-state patchwork approach. And he would take that national approach to testing, and much the same way that he looked at the Affordable Care Act. We remember that he said it was a very big deal when he was at the signing ceremony with President Trump. So he's very supportive of maintaining and bringing back any lowered regulations coming and connected with the Affordable Care Act. He wants to build on it and add a government-sponsored plan to get rid of government-sponsored plan as opposed to the Medicare for All situation that would get rid of private insurance. So he doesn't want to start from scratch, wants to build on the Affordable Care Act and bring back the individual mandate. He's also talking about increasing subsidies and coverages, extending tax credits to bring more into the system, including allowing undocumented immigrants to buy into the system through the public option at a cost of about, the campaign estimates it'd be about $750 billion over 10 years to implement this. Now, how it will be funded, we'll discuss that later when we talk a little bit about Vice President Biden's plans for some tax law changes.
Absolutely. And I just want to jump in here. I know that you mentioned the Seven Forces report earlier. Healthcare is one of the topics we discussed there, and you've lent your insights to that report. Can you tell me a little bit about healthcare lessons learned during the pandemic?
Well, we have seen some very positive things coming out of how the government and the private sector have reacted in a swift manner to COVID. We've seen great innovation and opportunities for growth in healthcare and in the life science sectors in such areas as the vaccine development. We've currently got about 8 different companies working on a vaccine. And part of that has been stimulated by federal funds and the federal government assuming the risk for the development and the funding, which has really lowered the barriers to entry for some vaccine developers, which is a very positive thing. And as a matter of fact, in this situation, failure of some of these aid is an option. In other words, we want to have a lot of opportunities to make sure out of those 8 we come up with some viable vaccines. So I think that's very positive. It's shown the public-private partnerships that can result in these scientific endeavors. So I think that's really good.
Fantastic. That's great. We've got some questions coming in via email into the Q&A. So thank you all so much for the thought-provoking questions. I can't wait to get back to that. But I want to get through our presentation so we can open things up. Mary Moore, I know that the economy is top of mind for a lot of folks. Obviously, it was undoubtedly vibrant at the beginning of this year, but took a nosedive with the pandemic-induced business shutdowns. What can we expect going forward under Trump, and what could we expect from a Biden presidency?
Well, it's really interesting. The candidates are similar in their slogans. We all know that President Trump is all about "Make America Great Again," and Vice President Biden has come out with the slogan "Made in America." So they have similar goals of increasing jobs. They're just going about it in different ways. The things that they do have in common are both of them are supporting onshoring and having more robust supply chains here in America, which is a great learning that we had from our 7 Forces paper. But President Trump is solidly campaigning on his tax cuts, his regulatory cuts. His approach is to sort of let the market forces work and increase opportunity for competition, whether that's through having opportunity zones and an economic recovery. Now, Vice President Biden wants to create millions of manufacturing jobs and has promised to create 5 million manufacturing jobs, but goes about it in a little bit of a different way. He would make changes to tax policy to have targeted business incentives to try to bring about his goals and whatnot for that. So when we look at the tax rates and whatnot, and you hear Vice President Biden talking about he would only tax the wealthy and large businesses, the wealthiest defined is those making over $400,000, and small business would be those businesses with less than 50 employees. And he would create a restart package that would help provide financial relief to small businesses to retain and rehire. In addition, MacKenzie, he would want to incent retirement plans for these smaller businesses, workplace savings plans, and the ability for small businesses to build childcare facilities at work. So you're going to see some tax credits coming out from Vice President Biden, which is a bit of a carrot. And then on the stick end of things, a lot more focus on executives making over $500,000, on those in the professional services area, and real targeted if any businesses offshore their business. There could be a 10% surtax on the company's corporate rate if they offshore in a manner that's inappropriately viewed by Vice President Biden. And then finally, Vice President Biden is known for having a long-time affinity for labor and would be supportive of a $15 an hour federal minimum wage. He would take a look at the gig economy, which think Uber, where workers don't have regular hours and benefits. And we've seen some litigation and efforts around that, whether these workers are independent contractors and employees. I think you'd see some incentives and efforts around there. And finally, Vice President Biden would make it easier to unionize. So I think that's what we would expect from the two candidates in the economy and a back to work scenario.
Great. Thank you, Mary Moore. Moving on to taxes. We know that one of President Trump's signature achievements was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which cut the corporate rate from 38% to 21% and gave pass-through businesses a qualified business deduction. Trump has hinted at a tax cut 2.0. Also, it appears that Vice President Biden will use the tax code to incentivize a number of his issue priorities. What changes to tax policy could we expect under a Biden presidency?
Well, if you take a this chart, it pretty well explains it. The corporate tax rate was reduced to 21% under President Trump in 2017 as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And Vice President Biden would raise that tax to 28% in order to pay for a lot of the programs and initiatives that he is proposing. He'd also institute a 15% corporate minimum tax, looking at book income to try to make sure that corporations, as he would say, pay their fair share. So there would be, I think, you would definitely see higher taxes on those businesses doing business as corporations.
Definitely. That's corporations. And we know that more than 90% of all businesses are set up as pass-throughs, those S-Corps, LLCs, and partnerships. Those pay their business taxes at the individual rate. What can we expect from our candidates regarding individual rates?
Well, this is where you hear Vice President Biden say he would increase taxes on the wealthy, and that's those individuals making over $400,000. Rates are currently at 37%. The individual rate was reduced to 37% under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But unlike the corporate rates, which were made permanent in that act, the individual rates are scheduled to retire or expire, if you will, in 2025. So President Trump would make those individual rates permanent. That on the other piece is those businesses that do that are pass-throughs, that are LLCs, that are individual partnerships. They have an opportunity for a 20% qualified business deduction to get their rates lower so they can be competitive with the corporate rate of 21%. Vice President Biden would raise the rates immediately back to the 39.6% on those individuals making over $400,000 and would take off the cap of the Social Security payroll tax, which is a 12.4% tax, and he would phase out that pass-through qualified business deduction. The other thing that Vice President Biden would do would be cap your tax deductions at a 28% rate. So there would be a bit of a haircut for those individuals at the higher tax rate. They'd take a bit of a haircut on their tax deductions as well.
And what about capital gains?
Well, here there's sort of polar opposites here also. President Trump wants to index the capital gains rate to inflation, which is currently at coming in at about 20%. And Vice President Biden would like to tax capital gains as ordinary income, which would result in doubling the capital gains tax for individuals at that higher 39.6% rate. So definitely a difference on the capital gains tax.
Great. I know that one of the issues on which we're seeing the most daylight between President Trump and Vice President Biden has been on climate change. What could we expect from each from a policy perspective, moving forward with regard to climate change and energy proposals?
Well, this is a fascinating area, MacKenzie, because on climate change, there really are the two candidates are polar opposites, and they have pledged to use the tax code to promote the exact opposite things. So if you look at President Trump, his focus has really been on energy and bringing back the energy sector over the issue of climate change. He is proud to say that he unleashed the energy sector as we are now the #1 producer of oil and natural gas. We're energy independent. And he campaigned on bringing back coal, opening up new areas for drilling, and use deregulation and tax incentives to boost fossil fuel production and therefore boost the economy. So he's taking the approach of being the pro-fossil fuels approach. And if you look at his tax preferences, they're all about enhancing fossil fuels and getting rid of some of the tax preferences that President Obama put in place. So if you look at Vice President Biden, his focus is really more on climate change as opposed to the fossil fuel industry. And you and I have spoken about one of the most important things coming out of the last presidential debate that we learned was Vice President Biden's goal to transition away from the oil industry. And by that, he says he means that he would end those fossil fuel breaks and have a net zero carbon emission goal to be in place by 2050. So you will see his tax incentives being very focused on renewables, electric vehicles, energy efficient buildings. So he really is focusing on that area. Contrastingly, he would not allow new oil and gas leases on federal lands and would create more federal standards and try to move us more towards what he likes to say is a cleaner environment and to make changes in that area. Another interesting aspect of that is that he would have a substantial part of his recovery plan focus on environmental justice, and that 40% of his funds for clean energy would go to historically disadvantaged areas. So I think we can summarize Vice President's plan as a very aggressive climate plan. He worked very closely with Bernie Sanders' team to move us to a cleaner economy. He is trying to position himself not as the Green New Deal, but using that as a framework for his possible plan. So we've got two different candidates on climate change. So we'll see what happens, MacKenzie.
Very interesting. Well, that leads us into our next polling question. You should see this popping up on your screen. I'm going to read it for our participants. Which issue is most important in determining your vote in the presidential election? Your options are climate, energy, or infrastructure, the economy, education, healthcare, taxes, trade, foreign affairs, and national security, or something else. Very interested to see how people respond to this one. I know we've seen a lot of shifts in polls on what people are valuing this election cycle, having shifted from previous election cycles due to some of those black swan events that we covered at the top. Mary Moore?
Yes, I do think that people are really feeling the impact of COVID, both from a healthcare perspective. And I like to say, homeschooling and take your children to work has come about with a whole new meaning in this COVID situation. So it's going to be very interesting what our voters find is most important to them, especially given so many of them have voted. What was it that was in their minds that was most important?
Well, we've just gotten our poll results back in, and folks are pretty split. So we've got a full 29% saying the most important issue to them is something we didn't list. Number two is healthcare with number two is the economy with 23%. Then healthcare follows at 19%. And then we've got a bit of a split, climate, energy, infrastructure at 13%. We've got 8% saying trade, foreign affairs, national security. Just 6% saying taxes, and only 3% saying education. To your point, now that every day is take your child to work day, I'm thinking we may not have that many folks with school-age children with us today. I think education is definitely top of mind for those parents of young children, but thank you all for participating. That was enlightening. Mary Moore, what do you make of those results?
Well, I think if you looked at the 29%, that might go to the personality issue. We do not have a monolithic voting population, despite the fact that we seem to have a polarized voting electorate. But I do think there are many issues, and perhaps what's most important, you may have had others that you would like to have picked, but we ask people just to pick the most important. So hopefully we're educating our voters on the various platforms as they head to the polls.
Absolutely. We did get a comment that for one of our respondents, the something else was racism and racial justice. I know we're going to touch on this later on, and we'll probably have some questions about that. But obviously, that is one of the Black Swan events that has come up this year and has taken over headlines in a way that is long overdue. For now, we're going to move on to trade. I'm going to start by saying that having served within the U.S. State Department under both the Bush and Obama administrations, I can certainly attest to the significant shift we have seen on the international front under President Trump. With that shift, trade has become even more closely tied to foreign affairs and national security, as we've seen with the discussions around Huawei and 5G. Mary Moore, what can we expect?
Well, it really is important for us to take a look at trade from these three different vantage points. They're all very, very important. And we can take a look at each candidate's approach. President Trump has approached trade deals saying that he wants fairness and reciprocity. So that is why we saw him taking action against China, because he was very much opposed to the tariffs and the non-tariff barriers they had to U.S. Goods coming into China and the trade imbalance there. The situation on China is very interesting in that there are both parties, Republicans and Democrats, do feel that we need to have a strong approach to China. It's not entirely clear exactly how both candidates would handle that approach. I can share some hints as we go forward. We've seen a lot of the tariffs imposed certainly by President Trump, and he campaigned against ending the job-killing NAFTA Act and has replaced that with the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. He likes to say he also renegotiated an agreement with South Korea and quit the Iran nuclear pact that President Obama had put in place and joined. And so we see that as a stark contrast to where Vice President Biden comes to foreign affairs, which has been an area of strong suit for Vice President Biden for a long time. Vice President Biden very much would like to end isolationism and rebuild alliances and relationships with allies. You hear him say that on the campaign trail, that he thinks that the U.S. is, when they're more constructively engaged internationally, that they're more successful as a leader. And I think you would see him take a reversal of the Trump policies and try to bring the United States back into the TPP agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He would like to bring the United States back into the Paris Climate Accord. And he recognizes that he would return us to the Iran multi-nuclear agreement if Iran would return to compliance. So I think you would try to see some reinstatement of the various programs under that President Trump has removed that were put in place by former President Obama. Not surprisingly, being a vice president and supporting President Obama, you would see Biden to reverse those policies.
Great. Thank you, Mary Moore. I know that we are now less than a week out from Election Day, with so much unexpected change continuing to dominate our daily headlines. Of course, most recently, the murder of Walter Wallace Jr. in Philadelphia. It's the latest in a string of killings of Black Americans that have really prompted a push for racial justice and the end to systemic racism that we haven't seen prior to this year. That is something that we're hearing a lot about in the Q&A, and I'm getting notes about from people that they'd like to hear you speak to. But Mary Moore, I know that's one issue that is going to be really consequential. But what other events are on the horizon, and how do you see all of the events playing out over the next 6 days that we need to watch and be aware of?
Well, I think that there is no doubt that the civil justice reform is a primary reason for many folks to go to the polls and to vote. And I think that that's where we'll take a look at voter turnout towards in a few minutes. And I think that will be a clear factor driving individuals to the polls. We can look at a very crowded timeline here. Next Tuesday is election day. It feels like we have been through so many events just getting to election day. And I think that you hear much talk about when are ballots due and conversation about mail-in ballots. And we can see that the latest due date for ballots to be mailed in and arrive is California for November 25th, but California, we could probably predict the outcome in California, whereas the swing states of Ohio and Wisconsin, they have ballots that aren't due until the 9th in Wisconsin and the 13th of November in Ohio. So if those are close swing states, we could be waiting a bit before we know the outcome in those states. Once the election is over, we know that December 14th, the Electoral College vote has to be ratified, but we still might not know the balance of power in the Senate, because it's very likely, if you see on our timeline, that we could have 1 or 2 Senate seats go to a runoff on January 5th down in Georgia. So that would be after the 117th Congress is sworn in on January 3rd, but before January 20th, when we will inaugurate the president. So we will see. It's going to be fascinating to see how all of this plays into our timeline. And in the midst of that post-election, we're going to have to see Congress up the funding for the federal government. So it's going to be a very, very busy time. You see lots of things on this timeline that we have to deal with.
I think I smell a CR coming. Much has been written about this season's presidential debates, obviously the first in particular. What did you take away from each debate, and how did they influence the voting public?
Well, it's so funny. The conventional debates truly would be if we had 3 debates in that they provided a key opportunity for insights and comparisons on the candidates' positions on issues of critical national importance. That's truly the goal of the debates. The first presidential debate, in the most con sense, can be described as unconventional. I think I could best say it looked like a WWW SmackDown, and it was unfortunate that we did not learn more about the positions. We did learn more during the second and last debate of their positions. It was really President Trump's final chance to sort of make up for lost ground on what he's for, to advocate on the economy. And Vice President Biden, I think, given the polling, just needed to just hold his own in that debate. And it's usually they have more of an impact on the outcome. But as we saw in our polling, I think that 50 million Americans had already voted by the time of that last debate, which was, a large percentage of the voters. We had 137 million voters in 2016 total. So, I'm not sure that the debates had much of an impact. I think more importantly is what we learned from the vice presidential debates, that it was an opportunity to see Kamala Harris and Mike Pence, because the vice presidents are often said to be presidents in waiting, given the age of both of the presidential candidates. So I thought that was a very informative vice presidential debate, and it was elevated to a level that we haven't seen before. So I think, I think the format of debates will be changed forever, and it's unclear to me in 4 years exactly what format those debates will take. But, that's all I can say on the debates for now.
Thank you very much for that. Of course, as we know, the Senate on Monday confirmed Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. Now, this was the most partisan confirmation vote for a justice in modern American history. The final vote came in at 52-48, with no Democratic senators supporting her confirmation. I'm just going to note this marks the first time since the mid-1800s that a Supreme Court nominee has not received any votes from the opposing party. And it does really seem to underscore what a number of Americans feel is a deepening partisan divide in Washington. With Justice Barrett having been sworn in yesterday, how do you see the Supreme Court shakeup happening just a week out from November 3rd and after millions of Americans have already cast their ballots playing into the election?
Well, I think that this was a case where instead of under the conventional approach, usually your Supreme Court nominee hearings are an opportunity to educate the American public on the nominees' views, history in voting, it's not in voting, history of cases, how they handled them, their approach to the legal profession, etc. But this was very unconventional. There was strong animosity, partisanship over the timing and the moving forward with this. On the Republican side, the Democratic side felt that it was extremely unfair given what had happened in the past. At the end of the day, we spent more time knowing where the members were on their particular issues, whether it was healthcare or how to raise their campaigning opportunities if they were in close races, and less about the candidate. I think it was more opportunity to share their various political views as to really, learning about the candidate. And that's just because of the situation and how it came about and where things stand. So I'm not sure, other than driving voters to the poll, will it drive those who are supportive of Roe v. Wade to the polls more, or those who fear that a more conservative court would overrule Roe v. Wade? I think there's possibilities that could motivate voters. But the reality, I think, is that most voters have already made up their minds before we even had those Supreme Court nominations.
I think that's right. And our polling certainly proves that out. We always put a lot of focus on the presidential election, but let's talk a bit about the potential balance of power between the White House, the House of Representatives, and the Senate.
Well, as you look at the current House composition, the Democrats are firmly in control. And I think that given the polling and the way the races are shaping up, that we can expect there to be an increase of at least 10 seats. And the question is, will there be more? Most of the increases are expected to come from suburban seats that are currently moderate suburban seats are currently in Republican hands that could be switch over to the Democrat. And as we look at the next slide, we'll see that there are very few seats, only 26 out of the 435 that are even a toss-up. But it's anticipated that if there's a push on the scale, it would be more to the Democratic side that we'll see an increase in the number of seats in the House, and that Nancy Pelosi would retain her position as Speaker of the House.
Absolutely. So if the House appears likely to remain under Democratic control, what do you expect in the Senate, where 1/3 of our senators are up for re-election?
Well, the Senate is really where everyone is focusing on in where they're campaigning and what's going on, where the money is pouring into, because currently Republicans, have a 53 seat majority. You need 60 votes for that supermajority to invoke cloture to move forward on a bill. And as you can see in the next slide, the number of Republican senators who were up are almost twice the number of Democrats who were up. And being an incumbent is not necessarily a good thing in today's environment, given the mood of the electorate. There are a number of those Republicans who are retiring, and there's many very, very close races. And currently, the pollsters that I respect are predicting a pickup of more seats by Democrats, and we could very likely see the Senate flip with this election.
Great. Just coming back to the presidential race, I know we began today's conversation saying that this election is turning out to be more of a referendum on President Trump than a choice between Biden and Trump. So in this final week leading up to the election, how would you say the president is doing, and what factors should we be watching?
Well, if you look at President Trump's approval rating, this chart just sort of says it all. I mean, his average approval rating is at 43%. Republicans rank him up in the 90% category, and Democrats rank him less than 10%. So that just shows you that it's the president's approval ratings that are truly driving many voters to the polls one way or the other. More the people going to the polls say that are Trump supporters say they're voting for Trump because they're for Trump. And interestingly enough, more of those going to the polls voting for Biden, it's not because they're for Biden, it's because they're against Trump. So I think that's a very interesting phenomenon that's happening out there. So that's what we really need to watch. And if you look at the president's scorecard, while he has a strong S&P 500 market movement in his favor, that's why the economy is the issue he polls best on. You can see that COVID really disrupted that positive economy that President Trump had to campaign on. And even if the economy were positive, his very low approval ratings are the challenge that he has not yet gotten beyond. Currently, the latest polls show he's at 43% approval ratings, and no president has ever been reelected with less than 48% approval ratings. So right now, I would say that it is a challenge, very much of a challenge for President Trump to overcome that disadvantage.
No doubt. Well, that brings us to our next polling question. Should pop up on the screen for you. I'm very interested to see the results of this one. In casting your ballot for a presidential candidate this November, are you more driven to vote for your candidate of choice or against the opposing candidate? Very interested to see how people respond to this one. I know there are some strong feelings on candidates on both sides, and those partisan divides just can't be overstated. Mary Moore?
Well, it just goes to show you that really personality. We've talked about this being a referendum on the president, and that is truly playing out. I think it's playing out in the sentiment of either being really for President Trump or really against President Trump. It's playing out in the approval and disapproval ratings, and you certainly saw it in the party. So I would not be surprised at the polling. I think within the Democratic Party, because there were a large number of candidates, many people, you've seen a uniting around Vice President Biden as the Democratic candidate because of the opposition to President Trump. And that will be something to watch, is the various factions within the Democratic Party are definitely coming together to elect their candidate. So very, very interesting to see the split in our poll results.
Definitely. We've just gotten those in. It looks like 2/3 of our attendees today say they're more interested in voting against the opposing candidate, with only 1/3 saying they're more voting for their candidate of choice. Mary Moore, what do you make of those results?
You know, I would say if this is reflective of the general public, I would guess that we have got we've probably got 1/3 Trump supporters and 2/3 Biden supporters. Just a guess. Who knows? We'll see if it's reflective of the public or not.
We'll have to stay tuned. There, of course, appear to just be so many unknowns given we're living during a continued pandemic with numbers again beginning to swell in many hotspots. We're dealing with uncertainty about voter turnout as well as when we'll know the outcome of the elections. What factors are you watching most closely going into November 3rd?
Well, I certainly think that, it's what is going to drive voter turnout. And we've talked about the civil justice reform. We've talked about COVID and healthcare and the economy. What is it? Will it be pocketbook issues? Will it be those issues that we've discussed? It's unclear how the lack of a COVID relief package, is there are many people who they've run out of their unemployment opportunities, that the federal subsidies that were helping them, the rental. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal today about rent relief for a time, and so how are those voters feeling economically, and morally, et cetera, as they go to the polls, and what is going to motivate them the most? So we'll just see. From the perspective of election day, we looked at the timeline that showed that we could not know when we had a president. Although I will share that I just heard this morning two prominent experts on voter dealing with elections on the Economic Club of Washington predict that we'll know by Friday. Now that will be interesting to see, can we know by Friday and what that's going to happen? I think that if you look at the polling, if you look at fundraising, if you look at approval rating, the presidency definitely favors Vice President Biden. And while the Senate is a toss-up, I think it's moving much more towards Democratic control, and the House is certainly going to be in Democratic control. And when I hear pundits who are very well respected, like Charlie Cook, he is looking for a blue wave. And the question is how much of a blue wave will it be? So I think everybody feels snake bit from 2016 on what the predictions were. But I think that you find that there's much more confidence appearing in the numbers. But because of 2016, people are hesitant to call elections. You'll hear many of the news networks trying to get people conditioned to know that we may not know the election outcome that night. So we'll see.
Absolutely. I have a feeling I'm going to be eating my tofurkey on Thanksgiving, still wondering who's going to be winning the White House. So Mary Moore, if recent polls and circumstances seem tilted in favor of Vice President Biden, what would it take for President Trump to win re-election?
That's a really good question. He has to make the case for why voters should reelect him, and you see him barnstorming all over the country in these swing states. Certainly in the state of North Carolina, he's been there multiple times. There's the question of the shy Trump voters, people who don't want to say that they're voting for Trump. How big is that group or not? There were 2.4 million Trump-type voters who did not vote in 2016. And the question is will they turn out? A very interesting New York Times poll showed, you take the New York Times poll and a Gallup poll that came out recently that asked registered voters if they were better off than they were 4 years ago. And 56% of those Gallup poll voters, registered voters that were polled, said that they were better off, even with COVID, protests, and riots, and a recession. Now, I like to contrast that to New York Times poll that while 49% said that they were better off, if they were asked the question, was the country better off, 39% said that the country was better off under that New York Times poll. So there's so many unknowns. Are people going to be voting? What issue is driving them to the polls? We've talked about a variety of issues that are driving people to the polls, and it's not always pocketbook issues. It could be personality. It could be the civil justice reform. It could be healthcare. So we really don't know. So I think it's really challenging. The one thing that I would really ask our everyone to think about, that a peaceful transition of power, no matter what happens, and a positive environment on Inauguration Day is the most important message that the U.S. sends to the world. So please, I ask everyone to remain calm as we go through this, and to trust the system and vote. The most important thing is to vote, because that's where you are able to influence the outcome. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mary Moore. I know we are a little late heading into questions, but do have a number, and we're going to try to power through as many of these as we can get through. Our first came in from Nick Rummel with Congressional News Service. Nick asks, let's see, what would the impact be of a prolonged period where we don't know the winner of not just the presidential election, but also senatorial races? What impact could that have on markets and on business in general?
Well, that's a very good question. And it'll be interesting to see how the markets react. Having worked for Morgan Stanley, I would never predict how the markets are going to react, but I do not think that I do think that the one thing we can trust is the system. We have a system for voting and counting them. We just have to we will just have a prolonged period. It won't go on forever. And both the Democratic and the Republican lawyers on the Economic Club said this morning they felt very strongly that the opportunity for voter fraud was surprisingly rare. I was glad to hear that. So I think that we just have to have businesses remain calm. There will be the uncertainty and lack of making investments if they're waiting on seeing which president's going to be elected and what the policies are going to be.
Undoubtedly. So our next question is going to combine a few I've received. It's on trust. So do you trust the polling is the first part. And then the second part is, which pollsters do you respect and rely on most?
Well, that's a really good question. So I really, you can trust the polling, but then it's the margin of error, So if the polls are so close, and the margin of error is if your candidates are within 4% and the margin of error is the same, that's what we saw in 2016. However, today, and you have to look at the polls on a state by state basis, Vice President Biden's lead is double digits in some states. And so the margin of error is usually single digits. So I think you can trust the polls more in those states where there's a smaller margin of error and a greater imbalance between the two candidates. I like to look at the NBC Wall Street Journal poll that is done. I respect both the Democratic and Republican pollsters that are behind that. They do it jointly together. And I think that it's a national poll, and that's one that I look at a lot. There are many good polls, but I do look at that one and look at the background results regularly.
Great. Thank you, Mary Moore. Next is also on trust. I got a few questions about this. Do you trust the results of the election this year, given the change in technology and so many people being remote with their votes? Do you trust the integrity of the system?
Well, that's where I was very pleased to listen to these experts at the Economic Club, Ben Ginsberg and Bob Bauer, who are on a presidential election. They each represent both parties, so you've got a perspective from both sides of the aisle, and they are confident that in due time that we will know the result, and that there is very little opportunity for voter fraud. I will say that there is more opportunity. There's less opportunity to manipulate the machines at the pollsters and whatnot by foreign entities. The problem for mismanagement is and havoc is through social media. Is how foreign entities, be it Iran or Russia or China, will try to put out misinformation in social media. But I think we can remain more confident. At least I'm hearing the experts say we can remain more confident. It just might take a while to actually count those votes, because Pennsylvania can't even open the first mail-in ballot until the morning of Election Day.
That's right. That's great. A couple final questions with more of a business focus. Given the potential delay of election results, how should firms be thinking about forming their public policy goals for the next 4 years?
Well, I think that first and foremost, you start with what's best for your business, and more and more businesses are looking at it from a stakeholder approach, as the Business Roundtable came out with their recent statement of you expand your approach to beyond just shareholders. And then it's very important that you have an understanding and an awareness of the political impact on your business. That's why I think it's very important to raise your political intelligence as to what the candidates are for and what proposals they have that will impact your business, and how you can, what are your opportunities and what are your challenges. So I think it's very critical that you stay apprised of what's going on politically, as we discussed earlier, because government does have a big impact. So having that awareness, having someone to advise you, just being more sensitive to it. I think you cannot stick your head in the sand and not look at, as the Seven Forces paper so eloquently outlines, what are the opportunities and how can you build on those. So I highly recommend that paper to our listeners.
Great. Thank you for the reminder. And we do have a link to that in the chat. I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question, and we'll make it a lightning round one, Mary Moore, because I know we're right at time. No matter who wins the election, the polarization across the country is unprecedented. In your opinion, what is the role of firms in helping to repair trust?
Well, I think that for starters, it's just listening to your employees, your suppliers, your customers. Many of us, need to practice that skill set of listening, of hearing where our diverse populations are coming from, what are the needs and challenges, especially in this post-COVID environment. There's been a higher awareness of, what will make people feel safe, included, respected, and involved in the workplace. And you have a diverse population out there of consumers. So I think that's important. I was on a program yesterday with Lisa Broom of the UNC's law professor, who has a diverse director initiative on boards of directors. And I think that it is more challenging for businesses in a COVID environment, but more important than ever, that they do listen and build respect and learn from their many voices that are out there. I think it's a real opportunity.
Absolutely, and one I know we hope businesses will seize. I know that we are right at time, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up. I want to thank you, Mary Moore, so much for sharing your expert insights, and thank you so much to our attendees for engaging with us and asking such thought-provoking questions. I am so sorry we did not get to all of them, but if you would like to continue the conversation with Mary Moore, I invite you to reach out to her. You'll find her contact information up on your screen now. And if you're interested in connecting with any of our other Kenan Institute or UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School experts, you are welcome to reach out to me at MacKenzie_Babb at Kenan-Flagler.unc.edu. And again, I welcome you to check out the link in the chat to the Institute's recent report, 7 Forces Reshaping the Economy, and to visit our website, kenaninstitute.unc.edu, for additional research and resources on the topics that we have discussed today. I want to thank you all again for joining us, and we hope to host you again soon. Take care.